You know, there are moments in a man's life that stay with him forever. They carve themselves into your bones, settle deep in your chest, and never let go. I'm 101 years old now, and I still wake up some nights with the weight of that choice pressing down on me like a stone. My name is James Callahan. Most folks who knew me back then called me Jack. I was born in the summer of 1923 in a little town called Millbrook, about 40 miles north of Boston. My father worked at the textile mill, and my mother raised 5 children on prayer and potatoes. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and in those days, that meant everything. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, I was 18 years old, working alongside my father at the mill. I remember the way the radio crackled that Sunday afternoon, the way my mother dropped the dish she was drying, the way my father's face went pale as ash. By Monday morning, I was standing in line at the recruitment office with half the young men from my town. I enlisted in the United States Army, and after basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, I was assigned to the 29th Infantry Division. Those first weeks of basic training were a shock to my system. The drill sergeants were merciless, pushing us beyond what we thought were our limits, breaking us down so they could rebuild us as soldiers. We ran until we vomited, did push-ups until our arms gave out, marched until our feet bled through our socks. I remember one sergeant in particular, a lean, weathered man named Sergeant O'Brien, who had this way of getting right in your face and screaming until you could feel his breath on your skin. He'd call us every name in the book, question our manhood, our courage, our reason for being born. At the time, I hated him. We all did. But looking back, I understand what he was doing. He was preparing us for the worst thing a human being can experience. He was teaching us to function when every instinct screamed at us to run and hide. We trained hard for over a year, running drills until our legs gave out, learning to fire our M1 Garands until our shoulders were bruised purple, learning to throw grenades and set charges, learning to dig foxholes and read maps, learning 1,000 different ways to kill and 1,000 different ways to stay alive. We practiced beach landings on the shores of England, wading through the freezing surf again and again, the officers timing us, pushing us to move faster, always faster. We didn't know exactly where we'd be going or when, but we knew what kind of fight was waiting for us, and we prepared ourselves as best we could for a war that seemed both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. But before I continue, if you're finding this story meaningful, I'd appreciate it if you'd take just a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it means these stories can keep being told. All right, let me get back to it. By the spring of 1944, we knew the invasion was coming. Everyone knew. The build-up in England was massive. You couldn't walk through Southampton or any of those southern English towns without stepping over supply crates or bumping into another GI. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation, with fear. We wrote letters home that we knew might be our last. We cleaned our weapons obsessively. We prayed. I had made friends during those long months of training and waiting. Good friends, the kind of friends you can only make when you're facing death together. There was Tommy Sullivan, a red-headed kid from Brooklyn who could make anyone laugh even in the darkest moments. He had a way of telling jokes that made you forget where you were, made you forget that tomorrow might never come. Tommy was always moving, always talking, always finding some way to lighten the mood. He'd do impressions of the officers, tell stories about growing up in Brooklyn, sing old songs in a terrible off-key voice that somehow made them better. When the fear got too heavy, when the weight of what was coming threatened to crush us, Tommy was there with a joke or a smile or a friendly punch on the arm. There was also William "Billy" Patterson, a quiet farm boy from Kansas who carried a photograph of his sweetheart Mary Ellen in his helmet liner. He'd look at that photograph every night before sleep, his lips moving in silent promises. Billy didn't talk much, but when he did, you listened. He had this way of cutting straight to the heart of things, of saying in a few words what the rest of us couldn't say in 100. He and Mary Ellen had been sweethearts since high school, and he'd asked her to wait for him before he shipped out. She'd given him that photograph, and he treated it like a holy relic. I think that photograph kept him sane during the darkest times. It was his anchor, his reminder that somewhere back home, someone was waiting for him, believing in him, loving him. And then there was Sergeant Frank Morrison. Frank was older than most of us, maybe 32 or 33, with a weathered face and steady grey eyes. He'd seen combat in North Africa before being reassigned to our unit, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who has faced death and come out the other side. He had this calm about him, this steady presence that made you believe everything might be okay, even when every instinct told you otherwise. When Frank spoke, we listened. When Frank moved, we followed. He wasn't harsh or demanding like some sergeants I'd known. He led by example, showing us what courage and composure looked like, teaching us not with words, but with actions. I think we all wanted to be like Frank Morrison. We all wanted to have that unshakable strength. June 5th, 1944. We boarded the transport ships in the evening, packed in like sardines, the channel waters choppy beneath us. The weather was foul. Rain lashed the decks. The wind howled. Half the men were sick before we'd gone a mile. I remember pressing myself against the cold metal of the ship's hull, trying to keep my stomach settled, trying to keep my mind from racing ahead to what was waiting for us on those beaches. The delay came that night. The weather was too rough. Eisenhower postponed the invasion by 24 hours. Those extra hours felt like years. We sat in that ship rolling and pitching, listening to the rain, listening to our own heartbeats, trying not to think about what was coming. June 6th, 1944. D-Day. I'll never forget the sound of those Higgins boat engines revving in the darkness. I'll never forget the spray of the cold channel water on my face as we lowered into the landing craft. I'll never forget the faces of the men around me, pale and drawn in the dim light, every one of us knowing that some of us wouldn't live to see the sunset. We were headed for Omaha Beach, specifically Dog Green sector. I didn't know then that this stretch of sand would become one of the bloodiest killing fields of the entire war. I didn't know that the German defenses there were far stronger than our intelligence had predicted. I didn't know that the preliminary bombardment had missed most of its targets, leaving the enemy bunkers and machine gun nests intact. All I knew was the cold, the fear, and the determination to do my duty. The ramp dropped, and hell opened up before us. The noise was beyond anything I could have imagined, beyond anything training could have prepared us for. Machine gun fire ripped through the air in continuous streams, the bullets making this distinctive crack, crack, crack sound as they passed overhead or slammed into the metal sides of the boat. Mortars exploded all around us, sending geysers of sand and water into the sky, the concussions so powerful they seemed to shake your insides loose. Artillery shells screamed down from the bluffs, hitting the water, hitting the beach, hitting men. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite and blood and salt water. Men were falling before they even got their boots wet, cut down in the first seconds, their bodies crumpling into the surf. The water in front of me turned red within seconds. Bodies floated face down in the waves, rising and falling with the tide. I jumped into that water, holding my rifle above my head, and immediately sank to my chest. The cold hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs. The weight of my gear, the pack on my back, the ammunition belts across my chest, it all pulled me down. My boots found the bottom, but the sand was soft and shifting, and every step was a struggle. I struggled forward, fighting against the waves and the sand and the sheer terror that threatened to paralyze me. A wave knocked me sideways, and I almost went under, but I caught myself, kept my rifle up, kept moving. Bullets whizzed past my ears with that distinctive zip-zip sound. A man to my left, a private whose name I never learned, took a round through the throat and went down without a sound, the water around him blooming red. Another man to my right was hit in the legs and started screaming for his mother, screaming in a high, terrible voice that didn't even sound human. I kept moving. You had to keep moving. If you stopped, you died. That was the only rule that mattered. Somehow, I made it to the beach. I threw myself behind a steel obstacle, one of those X-shaped barriers the Germans had planted to stop our tanks. For a moment, I just lay there, gasping, trying to make sense of the chaos around me. Bodies were scattered everywhere. The wounded were crying out for medics. The surf was pushing corpses back and forth like driftwood. Tommy Sullivan found me there. His face was splattered with someone else's blood, his eyes wide with shock, but he was alive. He grabbed my arm and shouted something I couldn't hear over the roar of the guns. I nodded anyway. We had to move. We had to get off that beach. The next few hours were a blur of violence and desperation. We moved in short bursts, running from cover to cover, trying to find gaps in the German fire. Men died beside me, men I had trained with, laughed with, shared cigarettes with. They died in the sand and the water and the wire, and there was nothing I could do but keep moving forward. By late morning, we had made it to the base of the bluffs. A group of about 30 of us had gathered in a shallow draw that offered some protection from the murderous crossfire. Sergeant Morrison was there, bleeding from a wound in his arm, but still giving orders, still keeping us together. Billy Patterson was there too, clutching that photograph of Mary Ellen, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it. Tommy was beside me, his earlier shock replaced by a grim determination. He looked at me and said, "Jack, I ain't never going back to Brooklyn if we don't get off this damn beach." I managed a weak smile. "Then I guess we better get moving." But getting moving was easier said than done. The Germans had us pinned. Every time someone tried to advance, machine gun fire drove them back or cut them down. We were stuck, trapped between the sea behind us and the enemy above us. That's when Sergeant Morrison made the call. He spotted a narrow ravine about 50 yards to our left that seemed to offer a path up the bluff. It was dangerous. The Germans would see us. But staying where we were meant certain death when our ammunition ran out. "Callahan," Morrison said, locking eyes with me. "You're on point. Sullivan, Patterson, you're with him. The rest of you follow in pairs. We move fast, we move quiet, and we don't stop for anything. Understood?" We understood. We all understood. I started crawling toward that ravine, my belly pressed against the cold sand, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the Germans could hear it. Tommy was right behind me, and Billy behind him. The others followed in a ragged line. We made it to the ravine. It was steep and rocky, choked with brush and debris, but it was cover, real cover. For the first time since the ramp dropped, I felt something like hope. We started climbing. The ascent was brutal. The rocks were slick with rain and spray, and the brush tore at our uniforms and our skin. But we climbed. Hand over hand, foot after foot we climbed. And somehow, impossibly, the Germans didn't see us. They were focused on the beach below, on the waves of men still trying to cross that killing ground, and they didn't notice the small group of soldiers working their way up the bluff through the ravine. We were about halfway up when everything went wrong. A German patrol appeared at the top of the ravine. 3 soldiers, probably sent to check this very route. They saw us at the same moment we saw them. For a frozen instant, nobody moved. Then everything happened at once. I raised my rifle and fired. The lead German went down. Tommy fired beside me, dropping the second. But the 3rd German got off a burst from his submachine gun before Billy's shot took him out. The bullets hit 2 of our men. Private First Class Robert Jameson, a quiet kid from Ohio who had joined us just before we shipped out, took a round through the stomach. Corporal Daniel "Danny" Burke, a tough Irish kid from Southie who had been one of my closest friends since basic training, took one in the thigh, shattering the bone. Both of them went down screaming. The gunfire had given away our position. Within seconds, we could hear Germans shouting above us, organizing a response. We had minutes, maybe less, before they came pouring down that ravine to finish us off. Sergeant Morrison scrambled up beside me, his face tight with pain and urgency. He assessed the situation in a glance. Jameson was gut-shot, his face grey, his hands pressed against the wound as blood poured between his fingers. He was dying. We all knew it. Danny was in slightly better shape, but his leg was a mess, the bone visible through the torn flesh. He couldn't walk. He couldn't even stand. "We have to move," Morrison said. "Now." I looked at him. "What about Jameson? What about Danny?" Morrison's jaw tightened. He looked at the two wounded men, then back at me, and in that look I saw the terrible arithmetic of war. We couldn't carry both of them. We could barely carry one. And if we tried, we'd all die. The Germans would catch us, and the mission would fail. And all of it, every sacrifice on that beach, would mean nothing. "We can carry one," Morrison said. "Only one." The words hit me like a physical blow. Only one. We could save one of them, but the other... I looked at Jameson. His eyes were already dimming, the light fading from them. He knew. He knew he wasn't going to make it. He tried to speak, but only blood came out. I looked at Danny, my friend, the guy who had shared his ration of bourbon with me on cold nights in England, the guy who had talked about opening a bar in Boston after the war, about inviting all of us to the grand opening. He was looking at me with such fear, such desperate hope, that it broke something inside me. "Jack," he whispered. "Jack, don't leave me here. Please, please, Jack." I had seconds. That's all. Seconds to make a choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I grabbed Danny under the arms. "Tommy, Billy, help me. We're taking him." We lifted Danny between us, his shattered leg dangling uselessly, his screams cutting through the roar of the distant battle. And as we started moving up that ravine, I looked back one last time at Private First Class Robert Jameson. He was still alive. Barely. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. I think he was praying, or maybe he was saying goodbye. I'll never know. "Go," Sergeant Morrison said, and his voice was rough with grief. "I'll stay with him." "Sergeant!" "That's an order, Callahan. Get Burke to safety. Get all of them to safety. I'll catch up." I knew he wouldn't catch up. We all knew. Morrison was giving us a chance, buying us time. He was staying behind with a dying man so the rest of us could live. We climbed. We climbed until our muscles screamed and our lungs burned, and Danny's weight felt like the weight of the whole world. His blood was soaking through my uniform, warm and sticky. He was moaning, trying not to scream, biting his lip so hard it bled. Every time we shifted his weight, every time his shattered leg moved, he'd let out this strangled cry that tore at my heart. But we kept climbing. Tommy was on one side of Danny, Billy on the other, and I was taking the lead, pulling them up, finding handholds in the rock and brush. Below us we heard gunfire, a brief exchange, then silence. Morrison was gone, Jameson was gone. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. They were gone. Frank Morrison, the man we all looked up to, the rock we all depended on. Robert Jameson, just a kid, barely out of high school, with his whole life ahead of him. Gone. Dead. Left behind in that ravine because I made a choice. Because I chose Danny over Jameson. Because I chose to save one and leave the other to die. I couldn't think about it. Not then. If I thought about it, I'd freeze. I'd break. And then we'd all die. So I pushed the thought down, buried it deep, and kept climbing. When we reached the top of the bluff, we found ourselves behind the German lines. The enemy was focused on the beach, on the waves of men still trying to cross that killing ground, and they hadn't expected anyone to come up through that ravine. We moved through the hedgerows and the farmland like ghosts, staying low, staying quiet, carrying Danny between us. The French countryside was beautiful in a terrible way. Green fields and old stone walls and little farmhouses, all of it peaceful and serene, a stark contrast to the slaughter happening just a few hundred yards away. We could still hear the battle, the constant rumble of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, the distant screams of dying men. But here, behind the lines, it was almost quiet, almost peaceful. It felt wrong, somehow. Obscene. We moved for hours, putting as much distance as we could between ourselves and the coast. My arms ached from carrying Danny, my legs burned, my throat was parched. But we kept moving because stopping meant capture, and capture meant death, or worse. By nightfall, we had linked up with elements of the 1st Infantry Division that had managed to push inland. We got Danny to a field hospital. They saved his leg, though he'd never walk without a limp. He survived the war. He went home to Boston. He opened that bar, just like he said he would. I never went to the grand opening. I couldn't. Every time I thought about seeing Danny, I thought about Jameson lying in that ravine with the light dying in his eyes. I thought about Morrison staying behind. I thought about the choice I had made in those few terrible seconds. Why Danny and not Jameson? Was it because Danny was my friend? Was it because Jameson was already too far gone? Was it because Danny begged and Jameson couldn't? I've asked myself those questions 1,000 times, and I still don't have an answer. Maybe there is no answer. Maybe some choices are just impossible, and the best you can do is make them and live with them. The war didn't end for me on D-Day. It went on for another year, through the hedgerows of Normandy, through the liberation of Paris, through the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge, through the final push into Germany itself. I saw things no man should ever see. I did things I never thought I was capable of. And I lost more friends, more brothers, than I can bear to count. Tommy Sullivan died in Belgium in December of 1944 during the German offensive in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge, they called it later. At the time, we just called it Hell Frozen Over. We were dug in outside a little town called Bastogne, surrounded by enemy forces, low on ammunition, low on food, low on hope. The winter of 1944 was brutal. Snow covered everything, deep and white, muffling sounds, hiding dangers. The temperature dropped so low that weapons jammed, boots froze to the ground, and men died in their foxholes, not from enemy fire, but from the cold itself. We huddled together in our holes, sharing what little warmth we had, eating snow because our water had frozen, chewing on hardtack because that was all we had left. The Germans had launched a massive offensive, catching us by surprise. They pushed through our lines, surrounded Bastogne, and cut off all supply routes. We were trapped. Every day, we expected to be overrun. Every night we listened to the sounds of German tanks moving in the darkness, getting closer, always closer. Tommy kept our spirits up, even then. Even in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, he found ways to make us laugh. He'd tell jokes about the cold, about the food, about anything and everything. He'd do his impressions, mimicking the German officers we could hear shouting orders in the distance. He'd sing Christmas carols in his terrible off-key voice, and we'd join in, our voices hoarse and weak but somehow defiant. As long as Tommy was cracking jokes, we believed we might survive. As long as Tommy was singing, we believed help was coming. The Germans launched an attack on our position in the middle of a blizzard. The snow was so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. The cold was so bitter it felt like knives in your lungs. They came in waves, grey figures emerging from the white, firing as they advanced. We fought back with everything we had, which wasn't much. Our fingers were so numb we could barely pull the triggers. Our breath froze in the air. Men fell on both sides, their blood staining the pristine snow. Tommy was manning a machine gun on the left flank when a mortar round landed in his foxhole. I was 20 yards away, feeding ammunition to another gunner, and I felt the concussion like a punch to the chest. The sound was deafening, followed by a moment of terrible silence. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of the foxhole but a crater, nothing left of Tommy but memories. I sat in the snow for a long time after that. I didn't cry. I was too frozen for tears, in every sense of the word. I just sat there, staring at that crater, remembering Tommy's laugh, his jokes, his promise that we'd get a beer together in Brooklyn when it was all over. Billy Patterson made it through Bastogne. He made it through the rest of the war, too. When Germany finally surrendered in May of 1945, we were in a town called Pilsen in Czechoslovakia. The locals greeted us as liberators, showering us with flowers and kisses and bottles of beer. I remember Billy standing in the town square, tears streaming down his face, clutching that photograph of Mary Ellen. "We made it, Jack," he said. "We actually made it." I nodded, but I couldn't share his joy. Too many of us hadn't made it. Too many were lying in graves scattered across Europe, or in the cold waters of the English Channel, or in ravines on the bluffs of Normandy. Every celebration felt like a betrayal of their memory. I came home in the fall of 1945. The troop ship docked in New York Harbor, and we stood on the deck watching the Statue of Liberty come into view. Some men cheered, some cried. I just stood there, feeling empty, feeling disconnected from everything around me. This wasn't the homecoming I had imagined. This wasn't the triumphant return of a conquering hero. I was just a tired, broken man who had somehow survived when so many others hadn't. My mother was waiting at the train station, older and grayer than I remembered, but with the same fierce love in her eyes. My father was there too, his mill-worn hands trembling as he reached out to shake mine. My sisters were crying, hugging me, talking all at once. It should have been a happy moment. It was a happy moment, but I felt like I was watching it from a distance, like I was a ghost haunting my own life. My mother held me for a long time, and I let her. I let myself be held like a child, because in that moment I needed it more than I needed air. But even in her arms I couldn't escape the memories. I could still smell the gunpowder, still hear the screams, still see the faces of the dead. But home wasn't the same. I wasn't the same. The town felt smaller, quieter, duller than I remembered. The streets I had walked my whole life now seemed foreign, almost hostile. The mill was still running, the same machines making the same sounds, but I couldn't go back there. I tried once. I walked through the doors, heard the roar of the looms, felt the walls closing in around me, and I couldn't breathe. The noise of the machines sounded like gunfire. The confined spaces felt like foxholes. The relentless rhythm of the work reminded me too much of the war. Everything reminded me too much of the war. The people in town didn't understand. How could they? They hadn't been there. They hadn't seen what I had seen, done what I had done. They welcomed me home with parades and speeches calling us heroes, thanking us for our service. But they didn't know. They didn't know about Jameson dying in that ravine. They didn't know about Morrison staying behind. They didn't know about Tommy's crater in the snow. They saw a returning soldier. I saw a man who had left pieces of himself scattered across Europe. I started having nightmares. Every night I was back on that beach, back in that ravine, back in that frozen forest outside Bastogne. I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart racing like I was still running from the Germans. Some nights I'd see Jameson's face, his lips moving soundlessly. Some nights I'd hear Morrison's voice telling me to go. Some nights I'd hear Tommy's laugh, and then the roar of the mortar round that silenced it forever. They didn't call it PTSD back then. They called it shell shock, or battle fatigue, or sometimes they didn't call it anything at all. You were just expected to be a man, to toughen up, to get on with your life. But getting on with your life isn't easy when your life feels like it ended on a beach in France. I drifted for a while. I worked odd jobs, never staying anywhere too long. I drank more than I should have. I pushed away the people who tried to help me, including my own family. I was angry, though I couldn't have told you what I was angry at. The war, the Germans, God, myself, all of it probably, none of it. It was Billy Patterson who finally pulled me out of the darkness. He tracked me down in the winter of 1947, found me in a boarding house in Providence, Rhode Island, where I was working as a janitor and drinking away my nights. He knocked on my door one evening, and when I opened it, there he was, holding that same photograph of Mary Ellen, now creased and faded with age. "Jack," he said, "you look like hell." I couldn't argue with that. Billy came inside, and we talked. We talked all night, two old soldiers sharing a bottle of coffee, sharing our pain. We talked about the war, about the friends we'd lost, about the choices we'd made. Billy told me about his own struggles, his own nightmares, his own guilt. He told me about the nights he woke up screaming, reaching for his rifle, certain the Germans were coming. He told me about the rages that came out of nowhere, the anger that frightened him because he couldn't control it, couldn't understand it. He told me that Mary Ellen had almost left him because of his drinking, because of his rages, because of the way he'd shut himself off from everyone who loved him. But she didn't leave, Billy said, his voice quiet but steady. She stayed. And she helped me see that I wasn't honoring Tommy's memory, or Morrison's memory, or anyone's memory by destroying myself. I was just adding another casualty to the list. Those words hit me hard. Another casualty. That's what I was becoming. Another casualty of a war that had ended 2 years ago, but was still being fought in the minds of the men who had survived it. I thought about all the nights I'd spent in bars, drinking until I couldn't remember my own name. I thought about the jobs I'd lost, the relationships I'd ruined, the family I'd pushed away. I was dying slowly, not from bullets or bombs, but from the weight of my own memories. "How do you do it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "How do you keep going? How do you live with what we did, what we saw?" Billy was quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, considered, as if he'd spent years thinking about this exact question. "I don't forget them, Jack. I carry them with me every day. Every single day I think about the men we lost. I see their faces, I hear their voices. But I try to live the life they would have wanted me to live. Tommy would have wanted me to laugh, to find joy, to not let the darkness win. Morrison would have wanted me to lead, to be strong, to take care of the men around me. Jameson," he paused, his voice catching. "Jameson would have wanted me to live. They all would have wanted us to live, not just survive, live. It wasn't a magic solution. There was no sudden transformation, no instant healing, but that conversation planted a seed in me, a tiny flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way forward. I stopped drinking, not all at once, but gradually, painfully, one day at a time. I started writing letters to the families of the men I'd lost, telling them what their sons and brothers and husbands had meant to me, how bravely they had fought, how much they had sacrificed. Some of those letters took me hours to write, the words blurred by tears, but I wrote them anyway. I owed them that much. I owed the dead that much. In 1950, I went to visit Sergeant Morrison's widow in Virginia. Her name was Helen, and she had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who had been too young to remember their father. I told her about the ravine, about the choice Morrison had made, about the time he had bought for us with his life. I told her that her husband was the bravest man I had ever known, and that not a day went by when I didn't think of him. Helen cried. I cried with her, and when I left her house that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace. Not complete peace, not the kind that erases all pain, but a small, quiet peace that settled into the broken places of my soul. I went back to Massachusetts. I got a job at a veterans hospital in Boston, helping men who were struggling with the same demons I had faced. It wasn't glamorous work, and it didn't pay much, but it gave me a purpose. Every time I sat with a veteran who was haunted by his memories, every time I listened to a young man describe the horrors he had seen, I was reminded that I wasn't alone. We were all carrying the same weight, and sometimes just knowing that someone else understood, that someone else had been there, was enough to make the weight a little more bearable. I learned to listen, really listen, not just to the words, but to the silences between them. I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do for another person is simply be there, sitting beside them in the darkness, not trying to fix them or change them, just being present. I learned that healing isn't a straight line. It's messy and complicated and full of setbacks. Some days you feel like you're making progress. Other days you feel like you're right back where you started. But you keep going. You keep putting one foot in front of the other. That's all any of us can do. I also learned that I wasn't the only one carrying impossible choices. So many of the men I worked with had their own moments, their own decisions that haunted them. A medic who had to choose which wounded soldier to treat first, knowing the other might die. A lieutenant who had to send men into a situation he knew was suicide. A tank commander who had accidentally fired on friendly troops in the confusion of battle. We were all carrying these weights, these burdens that civilians could never understand. And in sharing them, in speaking them aloud, we found a kind of fellowship, a brotherhood of the broken. I met my wife, Margaret, in 1952. She was a nurse at the hospital, a quiet, gentle woman with kind eyes and a warm smile that could light up a room. The first time I saw her, she was comforting a veteran who had woken from a nightmare, sitting beside his bed, holding his hand, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice. There was something about the way she held herself, the way she gave her full attention to that man, that made me stop in my tracks. She didn't try to fix him or change him or pretend that his pain didn't exist. She just accepted him, was present with him in his suffering. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. We started talking, first about work, then about other things, books and music and our families back home. She was from a small town in Maine, the daughter of a lobsterman and a school teacher. She had lost a brother in the Pacific, on Iwo Jima, and that loss had drawn her to nursing, to caring for the wounded, to trying to heal what the war had broken. She understood loss in a way that few people did. She understood that grief wasn't something you got over, but something you learned to carry. She didn't ask me about the war. She never pushed. But over time, bit by bit, I found myself telling her things I had never told anyone. About D-Day, about the ravine, about Morrison and Jameson, about the choice. She listened without judgment, without pity. She just listened. And when I was done, when the words had finally run out, she took my hand and held it, and she said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." That was it. No advice, no analysis, just acceptance. It was the most healing thing anyone had ever done for me. We married in the spring of 1953. It was a small ceremony, just family and a few close friends, in a little church in Millbrook. The apple blossoms were blooming, and the air was sweet with their perfume. Margaret walked down the aisle in her mother's wedding dress, and I thought my heart might burst with the joy of it. Billy Patterson was my best man. He gave a toast at the reception, and for a moment I saw Tommy Sullivan standing beside him, grinning that big Brooklyn grin. Of course, Tommy wasn't really there, but I like to think he was watching from somewhere, happy for me, proud of me. Mary Ellen sat at the table beside Billy, her hand resting on his, that familiar photograph now framed and sitting on their mantel at home. Margaret and I built a life together. We had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and I tried to be the kind of father that every man hopes to be. I coached their little league teams and helped them with their homework, and taught them to fish in the lakes of New Hampshire. I was there for their graduations and their weddings and the births of their own children. I tried to give them the stability and love that I had sometimes struggled to feel in myself. I wasn't perfect. I still had my dark days, my nights when the nightmares came and the old grief threatened to swallow me whole. There were times when I withdrew, when the memories pulled me under, when I couldn't be the husband or father I wanted to be. But Margaret was always there, steady and patient, pulling me back from the edge. She learned to recognize the signs, the faraway look in my eyes, the tension in my shoulders. She'd take my hand and lead me out to the porch, and we'd sit there together in the darkness, not talking, just being together. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was all I needed. I told my children about the war. Not the gory details, not the horrors, but the stories of courage and sacrifice and friendship. I told them about Tommy's jokes and Billy's photograph and Morrison's calm strength. I told them about the men who had died so that they could live in a free world. I wanted them to understand, in some small way, what that freedom had cost. But there was one story I never told them. The story of the ravine. The story of the choice. I couldn't. For decades, I couldn't bring myself to speak those words, to admit what I had done. It felt like a confession of guilt, an acknowledgement of something unforgivable. I had chosen to save one man and leave another to die. How do you explain that to your children? How do you explain that to anyone? It wasn't until I was in my 80s that I finally told the story. Margaret had passed by then, taken by a quiet cancer that stole her from me over the course of 2 terrible years. My children were grown, with children of their own. I was living alone in a small apartment, surrounded by photographs and memories, waiting for the end, but the end didn't come. It kept not coming. And the weight of that untold story grew heavier with each passing year. My grandson, Michael, was the one who finally drew it out of me. He was making a documentary about World War II veterans, interviewing survivors, collecting their stories before they were lost forever. He sat with me one afternoon, a camera on a tripod in front of us, and asked me to tell him about D-Day. I started with the basics: the Higgins boats, the machine gun fire, the bodies in the surf. But as I talked, the memories came flooding back, more vivid than they had been in years. And before I knew it, I was telling him about the ravine, about Jameson and Danny, about Morrison, about the choice. I wept as I spoke. I hadn't wept like that in decades. The tears came from some deep place inside me, a reservoir of grief that I had been holding back for over 60 years. Michael wept, too. He turned off the camera and just sat with me, holding my hand, letting me pour out the pain. When I was done, when the tears had run dry and my voice was hoarse, Michael asked me the question I had been asking myself for all those years. How do you live with it, Grandpa? How do you carry that choice? I thought about it for a long time. I thought about all the years, all the days and nights, all the moments of joy and sorrow and everything in between. And finally, I answered. You don't live with it, I said. Not really. You just learn to walk beside it. You learn to let it be part of you without letting it destroy you, and you try every day to earn the life you were given, to be worthy of the sacrifice. Michael nodded. He understood. Maybe not completely, maybe not the way I understood, but enough. Enough to carry the story forward, to make sure that Jameson and Morrison and Tommy and all the others would not be forgotten. I'm 101 years old now. Most of the men I served with are gone. Billy Patterson passed away in 2010, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. That photograph of Mary Ellen still in his pocket. The last letter I received from him was written in a shaky hand, but the words were clear. We made it, Jack. All the way to the end. See you on the other side. I think about the other side a lot these days. I think about whether I'll see them again. The men I lost. The men I left behind. I'm not a particularly religious man, But I hope there's something after this. I hope there's a place where the pain ends and the questions are finally answered. I hope Jameson has forgiven me. I hope Morrison knows that his sacrifice wasn't in vain. But mostly, I just hope I lived a life worth living. I hope that the years I was given, the years that so many of my friends were denied, meant something. I hope that the choice I made in that ravine, as terrible as it was, led to something good. Danny went home. He had a family. He had a full life. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough. The war taught me many things. It taught me about courage and fear, about love and loss, about the heights of human nobility and the depths of human cruelty. But the most important lesson it taught me was this: life is precious because it is fragile. Every moment is a gift, because every moment could be our last. And the choices we make, even the impossible ones, especially the impossible ones, define who we are. I made a choice in that ravine on June 6, 1944. I chose to save my friend. I chose to leave a dying man behind. I chose to keep moving forward when every part of me wanted to stop. And I've lived with that choice for 80 years, carrying it with me through all the joys and sorrows of a long life. If I could go back, would I make a different choice? I honestly don't know. In that moment, with seconds ticking away and the Germans closing in, I did what I thought was right. I did what I had to do. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Make the best choice we can with the information we have, and then live with the consequences. The weight never goes away. Some nights, I still wake up in that ravine, still see Jameson's face, still hear Morrison's voice. The ghosts are always with me, whispering their questions, demanding their answers. But I've learned to make peace with them in my own way. I've learned to carry them without being crushed by them. And now, at the end of my days, I share this story with you. Not because I want sympathy or absolution, but because I believe these stories need to be told. The world needs to remember what happened on those beaches, in those fields, in those frozen forests. The world needs to remember the men who fought and died, the choices they made, the prices they paid. We were not heroes. We were just ordinary men, thrown into extraordinary circumstances, doing our best to survive and to protect each other. Some of us made it home, many did not. But all of us, every single one, gave something of ourselves to that war. And those who survived carried pieces of it with us for the rest of our lives. In the war, I had just seconds to choose who got left behind. I made my choice. I've lived with it ever since. And when my time finally comes, when I close my eyes for the last time, I hope that Jameson and Morrison and Tommy and all the others will be waiting for me. I hope they'll understand. I hope they'll forgive me. But even if they don't, even if the weight follows me into eternity, I'll face it the same way I've faced everything else in my life. One step at a time, one breath at a time, one day at a time. That's all any of us can do. That's all any of us have ever been able to do. Thank you for listening to an old soldier's story. Keep the memory alive. Never forget the sacrifice. And if you ever find yourself facing an impossible choice, remember this: the choice itself doesn't define you. What defines you is how you live with it afterward. This is Jack Callahan signing off. God bless America. God bless the men who gave everything. And God bless every one of you. Until we meet again.